Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. My name is Ben, and today I'm going to be giving you a first look at some new prototypes from Evans Drumheads. For those of you who have watched all of our previous videos and the videos that I've hosted, you'll probably know that I used to work for D'Addario & Company and Evans Drumheads specifically, focusing on anything from product development to brand management and also managing all of their social media accounts. I had the privilege of working on the original UV1 drumheads when they came out years ago and experimenting with all sorts of different types of prototypes. We were looking at different films, we were messing around with coding. The application process was completely different from what we'd done in the past. If you're not familiar with the UV1 drumheads, they feature a unique type of film that was different from anything else that Evans had used for previous models of drumheads. And the coding was particularly unique because it featured a process unlike any other coding process that Evans had used in the past. This coating was applied through a screen print process and then cured with a UV lamp over the top. And so the UV1 series was geared at players that were looking for more of a traditional single-ply sound with a far more durable film and the most durable coating that Evans had ever produced, and arguably the most durable coating available on the market at this time. Now, a few weeks ago, the folks at Evans were kind enough to send over a set of new prototypes that they're experimenting with for me to check out, and they sent a full set. I've got a 14-inch snare drum head here, 10-inch tom, 12-inch tom, and then 16-inch floor tom. And all of these drum heads feature the UV coating. I got a little letter in the mail that came along with these heads, and it dictated that these are a 2-ply version of the UV1. This is not necessarily the final production version, but this is what they're experimenting with right now, and this is kind of the long-anticipated UV2 drum head. It's been a blast to experiment with these over the course of the last few weeks, and I've got plenty of demo stuff that I want to share with you today, and I also want to provide a little bit of context. But why don't we listen to what these sound like first, and then we'll give you a little bit more information about them. Now, the snare and the toms all feature these new prototype heads on the batter side. On the reso side of the toms, we've got standard G1 clears, and then on the snare drum here, we've got a snare side 300. So being that these are 2-ply drum heads, they definitely have a little bit less of a responsive nature to them. There's more mass involved, so at the softer dynamics, they don't speak the same way that a single-ply drum head normally would. I often switch back and forth between G1s, G2s, and UV1s as the batter heads on this particular set of drums. It was fun to experiment with these, which are also 2-ply heads similar to the G2s, but definitely behave quite differently, and this coating feels and sounds different. Now, you may notice that there's definitely less response from these at the softer dynamics, particularly compared to their single ply or even the G2 counterparts. Now, some of this has to do with the added mass, but it also has to do with the type of film that's being used. I don't personally know what the combination of film being used for these heads is, But I do know that it's a totally different film from what we saw on the UV1s, because if you look up close at the edge, right where that center dot of the coating ends, right near the bearing edge of the shell, you'll see that it's relatively clear. It doesn't have that cloudy, opaque nature that we saw on the UV1 series. So this is a different type of film, but still a much more durable film. I'm assuming it's probably about a 7 mil for each individual ply, so 2 plies of 7 mil. And it seems like these can really take a beating. I've experimented with the tuning range on them. I've tuned them low, I've brought them up higher, and I've played them primarily with a set of ProMark 718 acid jazz drumsticks, and these have a round tip to them that tends to be the downfall of most drum heads, especially when laid into really hard and played a little bit lower in terms of overall tension. These drum heads do not show sign of wear whatsoever. I've given them about 30 hours of total playing time over the course of the last few weeks, and they still look brand new. Now, they took a lot longer to settle in than what I'm used to from most Evans drum heads. Usually you can throw those heads on, tune them up, and they're ready to go. The seating process is a breeze because the collar shape allows them to fit on the drums, and I don't feel like I have to let them sit or really play into them and then let them acclimate to the drum. These were a little different. There was a little bit of a break-in period. I would say the first 5 to 10 hours, they didn't quite settle into where they're at now. And now they hold their pitch really well. Even as I'm laying into them and playing super loud stuff, I'm not experiencing any kind of pitch drop or wobbliness. If I come back in a couple days and leave them, I don't even really have to do a lot of touch-up whatsoever. So I've been very impressed by how these hold their tone. In the initial testing phase, I honestly wasn't super impressed with these, and I started to chalk it up to maybe, well, I've just been playing a lot of single ply heads lately, dabbling a little bit in the G2s, but I've always thought of the G2s as kind of an enigma when it comes to 2-ply drum heads. The G2s speak at a much softer volume. They've got a much wider dynamic range than what I'm used to when I try other competitor 2-ply heads to the Evans G2. So these seemed a little bit more in line, especially originally in those first few hours of experimentation. These seemed a lot more like what I find with the Aquarian Response 2s or the Remo Emperors. Regardless of coated or clear, it tends to be a little bit longer break-in period just based on what I've experienced. I do have to say that now I am really impressed with these. It's unfortunate that it took them a little bit longer to acclimate and really rest into the drums and go back and forth with tunings a little bit, but now I'm super happy with where they're at. The tone sounds great to me, and again, we're just recording this with a single C414 placed at ear height over on my left side here, and then we've got an AKG D112 just outside the porthole on the bass drum. In terms of construction, these drumheads don't seem to really feature anything different from the standard layout. There's nothing with regards to the hoop that's been changed, or at least nothing that I've noticed. There's nothing in terms of their collar shape that seems to have been altered whatsoever. It's really just that there's the UV coating on a new type of film. It's tough to say, but it does seem like there may be a different amount of coating on these than I find on the UV1s. That could just be me, and who knows, there are all sorts of different factors involved here, but it does feel a little bit different. The feel overall, just the tactile response from the heads, reminds me very much of the UV1s. Feels like there's a little bit more tension, just surface tension on the drum head, even regardless of how much tension the heads are under based on the hoops and the tension rods. I don't feel like these have the same tuning range that I'm used to with the G2s. They can't go quite as wide and have the same overall character, at least based on what I've experienced. At the same time, once you get these really sitting where they want to live, they sound fantastic. And I would really be curious to hear what these sound like when we get an individual mic on each of the drums and really experiment with the production side of this and EQing and adding some compression to see how much punch we can get out of them. I do have to say that for the heavier hitters, there's definitely something to be looked forward to with these heads. You know, if you've experimented with the UV1s and loved how they performed, but still put some dents into them because you're hitting hard, you're playing loudly, then these are definitely going to be the heads to check out. I was super impressed by the fact that they have not dented. I've taken them down in tension and completely removed the tension from them just to see if they've started to pit out at all. Nothing whatsoever. No dents, no dimples, none of that stuff. One thing I noticed when I put both the 16 and the 12-inch heads on these drums was prior to applying tension, there was a little bit of a dimple in the surface of the head. Just a little bit of a curve on one side. And some of that often comes from the bending process when they're taking the two pieces of material in a 2-ply head and bending them, that they will have a little bit of a buckle on a corner side. And that happens in certain sizes. It can happen with certain films. Usually it doesn't seem to do much to affect the performance and the tunability of the heads, though I did notice that these were the two that were a little trickier to get up to tension. When I brought them up, they sounded boxy for a little while, and I did have to just make sure that I was stretching them out and going through our normal process for tuning up tom heads in order to make sure that they were appropriately seated, not grabbing onto the bearing edge. And like I said, after a few hours of having them tuned up and playing through them a little bit, experimenting with them, I was quite impressed. They really did find their sound. I can't necessarily say that I would love these heads tuned up much higher than this. This is probably in the medium range or so. I don't really think that, at least on these drums, that I would like them much higher. I tried that out, and they're okay, they're great, but they start to feel a little awkward, and the tonal response, you get lots of attack out of them, which is normal for a 2-ply head, but you also lose a little bit of that depth and quality of tone overall. That just kind of drops off in the higher tensions. I've been told that these are going to probably be released early next year. Maybe we'll see a NAMM release on these. They're still doing some tweaks to them. Not sure what the rest of the feedback has been from other people who have been testing these. I do know that Evans is gathering feedback on these, and I provided response via a survey based on just my first impressions with these heads and how they've performed for me. When I used to work for Evans Drumheads, I would geek out all the time with different combinations of materials and experimenting, mixing and matching between different types of plastics to be able to produce different sounds. It's how we came up with the Black Chrome series. It's how we came up with a variety of different products over the years, and just experimenting and taking the information that we gleaned from experimenting on our own, and then also the response we've gotten from the market, people who are playing these heads all the time. And we would work with those materials and source new materials to see what we could produce. I'd be curious to see what happens if you were to take 1 ply of this material and another ply of the material used for the G2s and put them together and just see how they respond. Knowing that these have a little bit of a smaller dynamic range and the tuning range seems to be affected just a little bit, I would be curious to see if having a different type of film on the bottom or on the top might be able to alter that overall performance. Now, I'm sure that this is something that Evans has tested, because before they'll release anything, they'll go through all these different combinations and they'll exhaust the different possibilities. They also experiment with things like the thickness of the coating. Particularly with this UV coating process, they have so much more control and consistency in the amount of coating applied to each individual drum head. Now, another thing I did notice that threw me off just a little bit as I was going through the tuning process and mounting these heads was that the coating dot, the portion of the head that receives the coating, and I know that these are prototypes, so this might not be the final production version. These could have been rushed through the factory a little bit, but I noticed that the coated dot center portion was not always centered on the drum head. This can make it difficult to determine whether or not that drum head is centered when you're mounting it on the shell. You're looking through, you're looking at the bearing edge, and you're trying to determine, well, is it off to the side a little bit or is it dead center on the drum? Now, If you nail it, then it'll make the tuning process a lot easier. If it's a little off to the side, it's going to start to slip to the side a little bit more and start to pull over to the collar a little bit. And that's something that, depending on the amount of tension, you may experience some wonkiness in the performance of the drum. So I would love to see Evans really nail the consistency with that dot placement. And again, I do recognize these are prototypes, so who knows what we'll see when we get the final production versions of these. But my first thoughts on these, pretty exciting. I'd like to see them have a little bit of a shorter break-in period just to be able to throw them on and get working with them immediately, like we've come to expect with most of the other Evans heads. Thanks again to the folks at Evans Drumheads for sending me this full set of prototypes. I really appreciate being involved in the testing process and getting to experiment with this stuff and sharing it with you. It means a lot to be able to give you a first peek at these new prototypes that you really won't see anywhere else before they're released. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, just at Sounds Like a Drum, and you'll be able to find us. And share this video. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and let us know down below in the comments, have you tried the UV1 drumheads before, and are you excited about this 2-ply version potentially being released in the future? Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.